So this is my second kind of video doing this format. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Talia and I'm a junior at Duke and I haven't written anything yet. Alright, so let's get started. Today's video is going to be how to cut word count. And for those of you in the college essay process right now, you might be familiar with a lot of different word counts too, which kind of makes it difficult. They rarely ever go above 650 words. Usually it has to be less than 250 or less than 650 or less than 150. And then sometimes there are even schools with character counts, and that's a whole nother ballgame. So today's video we're going to be mostly focusing on 650 and 250 word essays that have word story arcs. And surprisingly, step one for how to cut word count is don't think about word count. Which is contrary to what a lot of people think. But in the beginning, you just need to focus on what content you want to share, what's your story. And oftentimes what happens is when you stress about word count in the very beginning, before you've even started writing, it's very much blocks the writing process. You kind of hit a wall because you're kind of stuck because you focus too much on what words you want to use, and that's not helpful for most scenarios because you forget that there's an editing process and you can worry about the words later and fix those down. Hopefully a lot of you guys are in that editing stage currently, and then that's where you want to cut words. So step one of cutting the word count is don't think about the word count. I love how I crossed it out. Alright, so now what is step two? Well, now they don't go in any particular order. I should first state that. But word count cutting happens in the editing stage. We'll just say word cutting equals editing stage. And at this is a point where like everything should be written already. So if you're not there yet, don't worry about the word count. If you are not finished with your story, do not worry about word count. Once you've gotten to this point, you can start thinking about being concise. And one of my professors said this really beautifully during the semester was be economical with your, oh my gosh, sorry. What did they say? They said be economical with your words, which I thought was a really interesting way to phrase it. And it's kind of like if you have a lot of money, you kind of want to save it. You don't want to waste your money, but like spend where you need to, and then don't when you don't need to. So a lot of times we'll be very verbose and kind of over describe the same things over and over again. Like my YouTube videos. See, we're already 4 minutes in, I'm already on step two. So you don't want to be too verbose. Examples of that would be over describing things, like I often do, but I feel like it's helpful and can be fun. And you also don't want to over narrate the weeds of the essay. And then to explain a little bit more what weeds are, it's basically the niche topic that you're talking about. So, for example, if you're talking about cooking, don't write the whole recipe or like the whole recipe or every ingredient step. That's literally what a recipe is, but just in case that wasn't clear. You don't want to do either of those two things. If you're talking about gaming, for example, don't explain how. See, I always miss words, and I'm only realizing that now, but you don't want to explain the whole game. So if you find yourself doing that, even with math, which is a, thing that all of us take, don't explain all the geometry or algebra that you might have been learning at the time. So here, this is where you can be concise and you can briefly summarize a lot of this stuff. Even if it's what your entire essay is about. You don't want to actually get into the weeds of the subject. You want to kind of focus on the relationship of these topics to you, but you don't need to explain how they work. So that's one thing to look out for, is to make sure that you're not over narrating, things like that. Another area where people struggle a lot, the most common in terms of concision, is, let's see, the setting. So don't over describe. Oops, don't over describe setting. What does that mean? Basically, we don't care how bright the sun was that day. You do not need to go on and on about how the sun was super bright and there was wind and the tree was the tallest tree you had ever seen with a cute little squirrel. Oh my gosh, I can't draw a squirrel. It's gonna look like a cat. There we go. With a cute little squirrel in the tree, and how it rustled in the leaves, and the water was the most sparkling blue that day, and there were tons of fish in the water enjoying their life while you were sitting against a tree reading a book while you're picnicking in the wind that was the sky with the bright, bright sun. All right, so we kind of see the point that that was a very, very large or over description of the setting, and we see that a lot in novels. Let's see, like I'm just throwing out a random novel, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, right? Homer probably was great at describing setting. I could be totally wrong. I know I read the Odyssey. I don't recall much about how well Homer describes the setting, but I'm going to presume that Homer, Shakespeare, a lot of those individuals are really great for setting the scene. And the reason why they're able to do that so well and so amazingly is because they don't have one thing that you guys are all experiencing right now, which is a word count. So novels don't have word counts, and because of that, we can't really incorporate a lot of the tools that we see people use in novels and things that don't have a word count. So because novels don't have a word count, they're able to go on and on and on about the setting, even if the setting isn't totally relevant to the actual personal growth of the character. Um, and especially in your case, and when the setting is relevant, it's more gimmicky. And I feel bad to say that Shakespeare and Homer are gimmicky, but it is, there's probably a better word to explain this, but it's more utilitarian for them as authors, just because, like, again, if it's really sunny for one character or really gloomy and dark and stormy for another character, that's a form of symbolizing that these characters are like opposites in personality, and kind of highlights, what their personality might be like. And that works in novels because they're fictional stories. However, it doesn't really work in the context of you as an individual. This person is you, by the way, sitting under this tree, which is why I keep gesturing towards them, gesturing. Essentially, sorry, I lost my train of thought. All right, but like your story isn't really fictional, so rarely is the setting going to be relevant to you, to that degree. So you probably might be over narrating the setting a bit, and if you have, okay, this is very common, so it might sound silly me to say it, but if you have more than 3 sentences, and sometimes people have paragraphs of describing the setting, that's a really great place to start cutting your word count. All right, so I'm glad we said that much. This one, hopefully won't be as long for me to explain, but let's see. I'm just gonna write a nice reminder that we're going for being concise here. So another method of doing that is to get rid of dialogue. I'm writing dialogue in quotes because that's meta, right? It's dialogue and dialogue. Ah, I'm not funny. Anywho, so you kind of want to cut down on dialogue where you probably don't need the whole script of what the conversation was. So, especially if the conversation was, okay, well, you don't need the whole script of the conversation, especially if the conversation was about how you had a fight with your sibling over nachos and you were trying to figure out who would get the nacho first and you were really upset about it and you said line by line what each person said over fighting over this nacho and then you were able to resolve the nacho fight because your dog, which is going to be green, again I can't draw animals, ate the nacho instead. So the dog got the nacho. Yay. I didn't even say any dialogue describing that story to you, and it was already really long-winded. And that's in fact what I would suggest in doing instead. Not choosing a really long story, but basically describe the conversation instead of rewriting the conversation exactly. Because that's going to end up being more effective. Sorry. So my pen really hates me. Describe instead of rewriting the conversation exactly because then we still have an idea of what happened. Like even from this picture, I know that you and your sibling were fighting over these nachos. Okay, what else? Move on from that, right? And dialogue really doesn't let you move on that easily because it's kind of like a big stop sign, which I know what those looks like. Okay, right? Because we're reading all of this script of just that one thing that you could have described in the first place. So that's really important, but one caveat that I want to make to that statement is that you are allowed to and should be able to quotations of important phrases are totally okay to include. So even if they occurred in conversation, you can describe the conversation and then mention the quote of importance that ends up being relevant to the rest of the essay. But the whole dialogue is going to be really relevant. So that might be a frowny face for some of you, but on the bright side, it cuts a lot of words. And that might stress some people out because the question is then, what do you do with all these extra words? And I honestly would just advise enhancing the content of your essay and making sure that you're building on the actual story and not kind of sticking in the weeds of dialogue. So dialogue, no, goodbye. Takes up a lot of word count. It's very interesting. It's just it can drone on for a really long time and it doesn't tell readers much about you at all, if at all. So that's why people really recommend dialogue, and it's a massive word count eater, which again, novels, Homer, Shakespeare, they can have as much dialogue as they want because they don't have to deal with the obstacle of a word count like we all do, unfortunately, for applications. So in the context of an application with a word count, you want to avoid dialogue. So for cutting 1 to 2 words, one strategy is hyphenated phrases. And I use this strategy a lot. I thought it was really fun. You can have fun with this one. It's definitely something you want to save to the end, but hopefully if you're cutting word count, you guys are all in your word count cutting stage. So one example, this is like a not so nice one. I don't know why I keep mentioning dogs, but one example of a hyphenated phrase would be a not so talented dog, where this whole phrase, not so talented, describes the dog. And because of the hyphens, instead of 3 words, this counts as just 1 word. Another way, like, and you can get very extreme with this, where you could go young, like I met a young, but wait, sorry. Inspiring and aspiring poet, where this whole phrase with the hyphen counts as one word that is an adjective that describes the kind of poet. So here, even though this person is young, they're very inspiring, and they're still growing as a poet. And you get all of that across with this one word. I would use this I'm going to put this in like orange sparingly. You should not use this excessively in your essay at all. You only want to use it where you think it's really important, really helpful, or really interesting. So I'm going to write that down because again, you do not want to use this excessively because it can kind of come off a little bit weird, and like I wouldn't say it's coming off like you're gaming the system, but you just want to be very, again, going back to what my teacher said, economical about this one. So I would only use this 1 to 2 times, and again, only in instances where you're like a few words over the word count, because when you're a few words over the word count, then cutting 3 words down to 1 can be very, very helpful. But if that's not the case, then I would avoid this. And if it doesn't work in your essay for whatever reason, because of the writing style you chose, or just it doesn't make sense to you, then I also wouldn't use it. But that's just something that is available to you that you could use if it interests you and you feel like it works in your essay. Alright, and the last strategy I want to talk about is like cutting the conclusion, which is contrary. Oh my gosh, I can't spell. We'll just pretend like that is a T. Cutting the conclusion, which is contrary to what we're used to in school essays, because in school essays, the conclusion is so important in terms of recapping, and we have to exactly restate everything in the essay and make a very universal, broad statement to prove X, Y, Z. And honestly, in college essays, you want to do the opposite of that. So I've written a conclusion that we can kind of look at and see what we can do to it to make it better, in terms of both word count and the essay as a whole. So here, let's read this little clip. It says, overall, I realized the importance of reading and how, and I forgot a comma, by reading books when I was younger and continuing to do so when I'm older, I can unlock so many stories. In doing so, I've read so many stories, and I want to continue reading stories because of how they've been able to positively impact me. Outside of the fact that's a little bit poorly written, because I use stories a lot, it's also not, or it's also redundant because we kind of recap a lot of stuff, even though I haven't written this essay and we kind of don't know what the essay is totally about. We can just assume it's about reading. And given that it's about reading, we already know the role of importance that reading has because you already wrote 550 words about that. So why am I writing the sentence saying again, books are important to me, when I wrote 550 words showing why books are important? So we don't really need this sentence at all because that's what those 550 words already described. Then, in the second sentence, again, we already said they've positively impacted me, and we also already know that from the 550 words where I described how they've positively impacted me. So, there's a definitely way to be more economical about this, and in fact, you can usually have really strong conclusions that are 1 to 2 sentences long, and I like conclusions that are more forward-looking or catch us up to date. That's ideally what you want to do because you can just continue to story that way. Sorry, I'm struggling. But you can continue telling the story, and then that way you don't have this abrupt stop in the story where we have to read this explanation of the story that we just read 550 words of. Instead, the conclusion can still work to be a part of your story. So here, some more effective conclusion that I've drafted. Today, I'm continuing to explore stories and have even tried writing some of my own. For now, I'm happy to snuggle by the fire and start this new saga. So I said start this new saga, and it's kind of unclear what I meant here, so I should have clarified like a literal like new book series and not a new chapter of life, but that's fine. Again, oh my gosh, you could be meta and do a chapter of life here, but that's not necessary because What would that add other than kind of, I don't know. It's a little bit gimmicky, but you could do it. Anywho, um, this ends up being more informative because it tells readers what you're up to now, which is writing stories right now, and assuming that this essay refer to like family members who helped you get into books, who led to your interest in books, then you have this really comforting, like hot, up to date, forward looking, like this is what I'm doing now, where I would also include that here. So with my mom. And if you add that little bit of it, kind of ties everything together. Again, all in just 2 sentences. And again, the conclusion is more of a conclusion of a story instead of a recap or an essay review. So this continues the story, or kind of concludes it, instead of a hard essay review. And that's kind of what you want to go for. So I know I talked for a very long time, but just to recap all the different strategies that you can use to cut word count that may be of interest to you. If I can use my screen at all correctly. Wow! I've been talking for a very long time, and this has been much of a struggle. But let's see. Alrighty, so going to text. Here we go. Strategies to cut word count. I'm gonna make this much longer and get into it. So step 1 is actually don't worry about the word count until you finish all the content. That's honestly what you need to do, because you want to get your story out there first. Now, in proceeding in no particular order, just in order of which ones interest you the most, we talked about cut narration of setting, which is, and cutting narration of dialogue, which are both more popular in novels and something that novels have the luxury of doing that you do not have the luxury of doing. We also talked about using hyphenated phrases, which honestly was my favorite thing to do when I was applying to college. But a caveat to this is that it only works when you're a couple words over. So if you're many words over, then cutting these other areas that I mentioned are going to be more useful. And then lastly, we just talked about cutting the conclusion, which I think is honestly the most useful and most important one that you can take out of this video. And I know that was a lot. If you made it to the end, congrats. And if there are any other ideas that you guys have for cutting word count or questions that you have, you can leave them in the comments. Thank you all for watching. Oh my gosh. Thank you. And I'll see you next time. Bye.